Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. And I feel in the presence of giants, both in our audience and here on the stage. We have a wonderful opportunity tonight, and so we're going to dive right in. And we have the opportunity to hear from two authors who have both had, as you've just heard, incredible careers already, and they're still going strong. And I wanted to try to frame this a little bit by saying that when I was first asked by Doug and Ann to talk about two books that seem so far apart, you know, in time and when they were written, I thought, wow, this is going to be extremely complicated. And then as I read through them, and each of these books and other books that they've written, I realized that they really do carry a common theme that we'll be talking about tonight, and that has something to do with the name tribe, and it has something to do with the tribal nature of serving in war, and what war does to people who serve in that or who observe it. So I don't want to talk too much before I give the floor to Phil Caputo first and ask him to read an extract from this incredible book. And when you buy this book tonight, if you don't already have it, you'll have to have a notebook next to you because you'll be writing lines that you'll want to remember for the rest of your life. Please, Phil Caputo.
I'll read just a couple of paragraphs from the book, both to give you an idea of the nature of the war as I experienced it and the emotional effect it had on me, which was, in the end, elegiac. The war started at night. The 8-inch and 155 millimeter guns commenced their regular shellings, and the VC began their sniping and mortaring. Our patrols slipped down darkened trails to set ambushes or to be ambushed themselves. On the perimeters, sentries listened and looked into the blackness, lighted now and then by dull flares. They waited, alternately bored and nervous, for the infiltrators who sometimes probed our lines to lob grenades over the wire or spray a position with carbine fire. They came in 2s and 3s, and that is how they died, and how our own men died, in 2s and 3s. We fought no great battles. There was no massive hemorrhaging, just a slow, steady trickle of blood drawn in a series of ambushes and firefights. Although there was more action than in the spring, contacts with the enemy were still rare. Almost every hour of every night, the same reports came in over the radios in the operations tent. They came in from outposts and patrols, and we could hear them whenever we stood watch, 20 different voices saying the same thing, like a choir reciting a chant: contact negative, all secure, situation remains the same. When contacts did occur, they were violent, but nothing ever really changed. The regiment sat in the same position it had occupied since April, and the details of the surrounding landscape became so familiar that it seemed as if we had been there all our lives. Men were killed and wounded, and our patrols kept going out to fight in the same places they had fought in the week before and the week before that. The situation remained the same. One of the things that was not the same was when my best friend was killed in action. His name was Walt Levy, Lieutenant Walter Levy. I dedicated the book partly to him. And I wrote an elegy to him in this book, and I'd like to read that for you. So much was lost with you, so much talent and intelligence and decency. You were the first from our class of 1964 to die. There were others, but you were the first and more. You embodied the best that was in us. You were a part of us, and a part of us died with you. The small part that was still young, that had not yet grown cynical, grown bitter, grown old with death. Your courage was an example to us, And whatever the rights or wrongs of the war, nothing can diminish the rightness of what you tried to do. Yours was the greater love. You died for the man you tried to save, and you died pro patria. It was not altogether sweet and fitting, your death, but I am sure you died believing it was pro patria. You were faithful, your country is not. As I write this 11 years after your death, the country for which you died wishes to forget the war in which you died. Its very name is a curse. There are no monuments to its heroes, no statues in small town squares and city parks, no plaques, nor public wreaths, nor memorials. For plaques and wreaths and memorials are reminders, and they would make it harder for your country to sink into the amnesia for which it longs. It wishes to forget, and it has forgotten. But there are a few of us who remember because of the small things that made us love you, your gestures, the words you spoke, and the way you looked. We loved you for what you were and what you stood for. Thank you.
Phil refers to the world outside the wire and the world inside the wire in his book. And inside the wire was a different world. It could also have a funny twist to it. When I was serving in Vietnam and I was at a small base camp, and there was a habit in those days to send audio tapes back home instead of writing letters. So we had these little tiny audio cassettes, and not even cassettes, they were reel to reel. And so I was sending these tapes back to my family, and suddenly I got visited by the Red Cross, and they said, "You have to stop sending those tapes back." Because in the background of my telling everyone how good it was and how everything was safe and calm was a 155 millimeter cannon going off about every 3 minutes. Now, you did manage to detach yourself once you got inside the wire, that's no doubt about it. But the theme that I found right away in these two main books that we're looking at tonight has to do with the word tribe. That we see this compact, this group of people who call themselves a tribe, and they might be members of a platoon or they might be an actual tribe. And Sebastian has written a lot about this in a way that really fascinating, in a fascinating way, pulls together these two ideas of the tribe in Vietnam or the tribe in Korengal Valley and the tribes that we have in our society. So I'll ask Sebastian now to read a bit.
Thank you so much. That was a really beautiful and heartbreaking elegy, by the way. Thank you for reading that. This book is about community, about human groups. We're a social species, and we do well when we're in a group with people that we're close to, and we do terribly on our own. We die, basically. I started trying to unravel this idea after I spent a year off and on with a platoon in combat in eastern Afghanistan. I'd covered war for a long time. I'd never been with American soldiers. And to my surprise, after a brutally hard deployment, a few months after they got back to their base in Italy, most of the guys that I was with wanted to go back. They didn't want to come home to America. They wanted to go home to Restrepo. That's how they thought of it. And I was trying to, I thought this needs to be understood because it's not an obvious choice. So this is just the beginning, the first couple of paragraphs of my book, Tribe. Perhaps the single most startling fact about America is that, alone among the modern nations that have become world powers, it did so while butted up against 3,000 miles of howling wilderness, populated by Stone Age tribes. From King Philip's War in the 1600s until the last Apache cattle raids across the Rio Grande in 1924, America waged an ongoing campaign against a native population that had barely changed technologically in 15,000 years. Over the course of 3 centuries, America became a booming industrial society that was cleaved by class divisions and racial injustice, but glued together by a body of law that, theoretically at least, saw all people as equal. The Indians, on the other hand, and by the way, I use that word because I was admonished by an Apache who told me that Native American simply means someone who's born in North America. Well, he was an Indian. So just to make that clear, I considered him more of an authority than me on that word. So Indian it is. The Indians, on the other hand, lived communally in mobile or semi-permanent encampments that were more or less run by consensus and broadly egalitarian. Individual authority was earned rather than seized and imposed only on people who were willing to accept it. Anyone who didn't like it was free to move somewhere else. The proximity of these two cultures over the course of many generations presented both sides with a stark choice about how to live. By the end of the 19th century, factories were being built in Chicago, and slums were taking root in New York, while Indians fought with spears and tomahawks 1,000 miles away. It may say something about human nature that a surprising number of Americans, mostly men, wound up joining Indian society rather than staying in their own. They emulated Indians, married them, were adopted by them, and on some occasions even fought alongside them. And the opposite almost never happened. Indians almost never ran away to join white society. Emigration always seemed to go from the civilized to the tribal, and it left Western thinkers flummoxed about how to explain such an apparent rejection of their society. Thank you.
Now, Sebastian, just to continue on that theme, the appeal of tribal life can seem somewhat mysterious when we characterize these tribes as primitive and brutal and so unlike what the people who left those societies were brought up to understand was valuable. Today, in modern society, people can live alone and feel safe, but they are not part of that tribe. What does the tribal life have that the modern society fails to deliver that would cause these soldiers to say, I want to go back to the tribe in Coronel Valley?
Yeah, I mean, the irony, and it makes perfect evolutionary sense, but the irony of the sort of human spirit is that the worse the circumstances, the better the behavior. The worse things are, the better people act with each other. And that's because humans survive collectively, and individually they die. And so as things get bad, there is a pressure based in our evolution, a pressure to collectivize, to organize in very closely knit groups. When things stabilize, when they're more peaceful, when they're easier, there is also an evolutionary pressure to pursue individual interests. So the individual interest and the sort of commitment to the group, those are two drivers in human behavior, and basically they exist in a kind of dynamic tension. And as crises arise, people group together, they lose their individual autonomy, but they survive, then things get better, and off they go again. And what's interesting about this is that clearly, in our evolutionary past, conditions were difficult and dangerous, because it seems to be that people, if they are allowed to become too individual, to live lives that are too autonomous from the group, there's a great liberty there, but it's very, very difficult on our mental health. And so the irony for modern society is that as wealth goes up and individuality goes up, the suicide rate goes up. As things get easier for us physically and more convenient, more automated, the suicide rate goes up, the depression rate goes up, the anxiety rate goes up, the PTSD rate goes up, all of those sort of mental health values, all those lines go in the wrong direction. And as soon as there's a crisis, for example, 9/11, I live in New York City, after 9/11, the suicide rate went down in New York. I found a study in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, 1969, 1970. There was a lot of violence and riots and a very, very violent time in Northern Ireland. And an Irish sociologist did a study and found that he studied mental health rates district by district, and the more violent the district, the lower the rate of depression. And the only county that saw depression go up was County Derry, that had no violence whatsoever.
Phil, you also talk about this post-traumatic stress, and you describe in one of your books the idea that you came out of the war and you certainly didn't seek out a relaxing lifestyle. You ended up at the Democratic National Convention in 1968, but this idea that you found some comfort until that moment when suddenly you were taken back into flashbacks of Vietnam. What happened to you in that circumstance?
Now, you're not speaking of the Democratic National Convention.
No.
Right? Okay.
Well, that was also
I was not elected. Well, no, I think what does happen is that in the experience of battle is very seductive. We all know that it's horrible. We all know that it's awful. Everybody says so. But what is often denied is the attractiveness of it. And one of the elements of the attractiveness of it, and it speaks to some points that Sebastian has made in his book, is that you feel and you are absolutely, utterly necessary in that environment, not in some great cause or anything like that, but absolutely necessary to your immediate buddies, your comrades, and you are necessary for accomplishing the mission. And when that's all over with, it can be a very kind of depressing experience that suddenly you don't have this mission, suddenly you don't feel that you're all that necessary anymore, and you begin to look for and seek out situations in which you do feel and which you may be indeed necessary.
So you become a sort of adrenaline junkie, and I mean, both of your lifestyles would suggest that has happened to both of you in terms of what you did after what you did after Vietnam, and Sebastian, what you continue to do from Sarajevo to Afghanistan and beyond.
I would say that it was more, I mean, we all have a positive reaction to adrenaline, right? I mean, everyone does. I would say we were, to follow on what Phil's saying, we're meaning junkies. We want to do something that feels meaningful and that has consequences, even if those consequences are life and death, but still they're consequences. I grew up in a very, very placid, uninteresting suburb. And, frankly, it was a kind of slow death, spiritual death. I mean, as a young man, there was no way, I realized when I was 17 or 18, there was actually no way in Belmont, Massachusetts, that I was going to be able to demonstrate my sort of worthiness as a man, like as an adult, as a mature person. And I was never going to be tested in any way that meant anything, and without breaking the law. That was the only way and so I went ahead and broke the law. Like, I mean, in a sort of minor, inconsequential way, but I wanted to see, like, okay, can I get away with this? Can I outrun the police? Actually, is what I wanted to find out. I wish there'd been a way to demonstrate my sort of prowess in a way that served the tribe, but there just wasn't one. One way to do that is to enlist during wartime. I mean, that's a very classic way for young men to sort of prove themselves.
And is that why you joined the Marine Corps, or what drove you to that
Yeah,
decision?
I mean, I think I also grew up in a placid, inconsequential suburb.
Well, you guys don't know anything about my neighborhood in Philadelphia, I'll tell you that.
It was in Illinois, not in Massachusetts, but I think a lot of them have a certain similarity. And I grew up in the shadow of World War II, and fathers and uncles and other relatives who had served in it in this great crusade, this great cause in which they were warriors. Even if two of them I know never actually saw combat, but nevertheless I thought of them that way. And so I wanted to fulfill a destiny myself in that way, and that's why I joined the Marines. I want to add, though, that after I came back from Vietnam, after a period of searching and so forth, that one of the reasons I went into journalism and ended up doing the kind of journalism I did, which at first was investigative journalism and then later was foreign correspondence, was because I felt that gave my life a certain amount of meaning, and that what I was doing was contributing in a positive way to, call it my tribe or to my society. One of my first early assignments was covering the mob in Chicago, and I felt that
Not Mayor Daley you're talking about, but
no, that was a different mob. That was the Irish mob. This was the and I felt that I was doing something that meant something, and that was my, if you want to call it that, my substitute for that feeling or that emotion that you have in combat.
Oh, that's a pretty tricky thing. And Sebastian, the soldiers that you interviewed, and I have to say, if you have not watched the movie Korengal or Restrepo, Sebastian and Tim Hetherington, the late Tim Hetherington, who was killed, was a photographer with Sebastian. When I tell people about those two movies, I say, well, Restrepo was the front lines, and these two guys were in front of the front lines. They were, I mean, it was totally crazy what you were doing. But you found that the people there were serving this higher cause, but they weren't talking about democracy or serving freedom. Why were they there, and what attracted them to come back there?
Well, there's two levels to it. I mean, first of all, why did they join? Why did they join the military, and why did they work so hard to get into a combat unit? Like, if you just need a job and a skill and a paycheck, it's very easy to join the military and wind up, changing the oil on Humvees at a rear base. There's nothing simpler than that. It's quite hard to get into a combat unit. The 173rd Airborne, I mean, it's like making the football team in high school. They all really wanted, every guy that I knew out there really wanted to experience combat. Like, actively, like, I want to know what happens in combat. A lot of them had fathers who fought in Vietnam, grandfathers in World War II. Most of them were sort of like middle class white kids, lower middle class white kids, and so they joined for that sort of personal reason. There was a sort of veneer of 9/11, but that didn't really matter. I think most of them would have not joined had there not been a war to fight. Honestly, I think they would have done something else. But the proximal reason that they fought when they were in combat, I mean, the thing that got them to take risks, to go beyond themselves, to not think about themselves, actually, that loss of identity, that loss of sort of personal concern that is absolutely essential in combat. The thing that caused that was their love for each other, and I do mean love. I mean, if you are willing to risk your life or give your life for another person, you love that person, even if you don't like them very much. And the contract, if you're in a platoon in combat, the contract between everybody is that I may not like you, but I'll die for you. And if everyone acts that way, everyone in the platoon has a much higher chance of coming home alive. So that being embedded in, I mean, I don't mean in the journalistic sense, being part of a group like that has that kind of elemental commitment to itself, to each other, is incredibly reassuring. And war abounds in ironies, right? And one of them is that these guys literally felt safer in that sort of secure nest of the platoon. They felt safer in combat with each other than they felt alone in society not getting shot at. That is the cripplingly hard thing to navigate when soldiers come back. And what they missed when they got home, a little bit, they missed a little bit of the adrenaline, a little bit of the meaning, whatever, but I think what they really missed was being part of something, of serving something that was bigger than them that made them feel secure. And they could not get that in the cul-de-sac in their suburb where they lived.
Well, this band of brothers.
Excuse
Go
me,
ahead.
I
please.
mean, I think the great Midwestern novelist Willa Cather said it perfectly, and I think it was in her novel My Antonia, where she says that the greatest happiness is to immerse oneself in something greater than oneself, and that I think is.
Now, this gets pretty tricky, though, when you look at Vietnam, where the word Vietnam became almost like a curse word and something you didn't tell people when you came back. It had this smear on it, as you mentioned it in one of your readings earlier. It was, fortunately now we have a Vietnam memorial, but I find watching now, years later, Ken Burns and saying, why is it now, 50 years later, we're still struggling with this? What is the connection between our society today and that society that produced Vietnam? What do you see as the link here?
Well, I think the interesting thing, and more than interesting, is that 50 years down the line, this is still a subject that we talk about, that we discuss, and that people like Ken Burns make documentaries about. He spent 10 years on that, making that documentary. And I think the reason is that a lot of people in this country, and maybe most of the country, realizes subconsciously, if not consciously, that the country we're living in today was birthed, was formed during the Vietnam era. Not just the war itself, but the whole anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, all of these things occurred simultaneously, but with the war as the epicenter of this, call it a kind of an earthquake, and or a social earthquake, a cultural earthquake. And that is something we have not yet come to terms with. If I can find it, there is a quote that I like to cite from, my fingerprint thing is telling me to try again, okay. It's apparently
Torpedo by technology.
All right, just
okay.
a second. 196. I'll try again. 19645 6.
I have a flip phone,
Believe it.
so I don't have
Okay,
to go
right,
through
yeah.
this.
I can't believe this is happening. All right, let me start all over again. All right, here we go. Okay. It's from a scholar named John Hellman from Ohio State University. He wrote a book some years ago called American Myth and the Legacy of Vietnam. And he said, quote, Vietnam is an experience that has severely called into question American myth. Americans entered Vietnam with certain expectations that a story, a distinctly American story, would unfold. When the story of America in Vietnam turned into something unexpected, the true nature of the larger American story itself became the subject of intense cultural dispute. On the deepest level, the legacy of Vietnam is the disruption of our story, of our explanation of the past, and our vision of the future. And I think that that is something that we are still wrestling with. And I believe that Jack and I were discussing this earlier, that, I was discussing it with Doug, actually, that we we knew that Ken Burns hoped that his documentary would, I think Doug's word would be crop dust America, and that everyone would be reopening that conversation about that war, but that hasn't happened because I think the country is just still finds that experience, despite its distance in time, still too difficult and too complex and too painful to deal with.
That's absolutely true. Now, but when you think about Vietnam and the lost, let's say, the hopelessness of the cause, the watching of the American embassy being evacuated in the last days, again, and it immediately brought to my mind, okay, Khe Sanh, Fallujah, Garmsir, all these names of places that people never go to and never will, that were places where American soldiers went and fought and died. And we ask ourselves, what for? What are we doing this for? Now, Sebastian, you've dealt with people who've come back from the war quite a bit. What did they tell you? Why did they go to war, and what did they find when they got back here that caused them to sink into depression and alcoholism and drugs and so on?
So the soldiers that I was with didn't think about or talk about the rationale for the war, particularly in Afghanistan. It was quite obvious. It was 9/11. The people that perpetrated that horror had refuge in Afghanistan. President Bush demanded that they be rendered for justice to this country. The Taliban refused, and in we went. And it had a kind of simple logic. Iraq did not. I refused to cover Iraq because I was completely opposed to it, and as a journalist, I felt that if I couldn't be neutral, if I couldn't be at least open to the logic of Iraq, then my reporting would be too biased. So I didn't go to Iraq. I don't know about that. But in Afghanistan, it made a kind of sense. There was year after year of terrible blunders. But again, the reason for the war was quite obvious, and so the soldiers didn't really talk about it. And also, they were young. I mean, they were 18, 19, 20 years old. When I was that age, I wasn't talking about sort of national, international affairs either. I mean, they were very interested in their own personal lives and in combat. Combat sort of out of the context of the political reason for it. So, but when they came home, the reason that they struggled psychologically wasn't because the war didn't have meaning. It didn't need to have meaning for them to go in the first place. That wasn't what they were predicating their effort on. They struggled some of them were traumatized. About 10% of the U.S. military is in combat. The rest are mostly in support units, and they're really not traumatized, or certainly not regularly. But everyone apparently is prone to psychological troubles or vulnerable to them when they come back from that experience. And I think the reason is this sort of radical transition from a very close connected communal experience in a platoon back to modern society with these incredibly high rates of suicide and depression and everything else. Even Peace Corps volunteers that come back after 2 years overseas, usually in a small-scale, rural, agrarian community in the developing world, even Peace Corps volunteers, around 1 in 4, experience a really significant depression when they get back, quote, home, when they get home to this country. They struggle with depression, just like soldiers do. So if you think about our evolutionary past, we evolved to live in groups of 30, 40, 50 people in a very challenging environment where we really had to rely on one another. That's a platoon in combat. That's exactly what that is. We're wired for it. When we're exposed to it, we respond in very positive ways. And then when that's taken away from us, when you're repatriated back to the United States, for all of its convenience and its blessings and its luxury and its rule of law and everything else, for all of that, that primal experience of being in a small group, sleeping in a group, taking meals in a group, doing things in a group, that resonates very, very deeply with people, and it's extremely traumatic to give it up.
Well, I have to ask though, the experience of combat strips away part of your humanity and part of your social mores, I would say. That when Phil, you described heading out on patrol, it was like sliding over the edge. You said to a sergeant, "We are so far out, it might as well be the dark side of the moon." And he replied, "What do you mean, might as well be?" You feel like you're marooned on a hostile shore. You're out somewhere that's not of this earth. You are in another world where the rules are completely stripped away. You can shoot someone who's a certain distance away and it's legal, but if they get close to you and put their hands up, you're not supposed to shoot at some point. There's these rules of engagement, so-called. When you go through that process over and over again, or you're out at Restrepo and you've got a 50 caliber machine gun in front of you, and you see, well, I wonder how far this thing can shoot and what it could do to a guy a mile away, and you do it, and that's legal. There has to be an impact on the individual first and then on society. What is that? Are we paying a price that we're just going to keep paying now?
Well, a theme that I've touched on over and over again in the fiction I've written has been how people react and how they behave in situations where the usual guideposts to what we would call moral behavior are absent. And certainly in combat, so to speak, you have a license to kill, the ultimate taboo. And this tends to affect the perpetrators or the people who actually do the killing, but usually after you've returned to society. You look, even now, I mean, I look back on myself half a century ago, and I'm like looking back on somebody that I don't quite recognize. And I think that one of the paradoxes of this experience, as Sebastian says, there is this intense camaraderie that you have, living with this so-called tribal group. At the same time, your situation is miserable. You know what I used to think of when I was there? I said, wouldn't it be great to wake up in the morning on clean sheets with a cup of coffee? That was my big dream of returning home, was to drink a cup of coffee on a bed with clean sheets. But once you get back to the clean sheets and the cup of coffee, all of a sudden something vital seems to be missing. And also, I would have to add, is that sometimes your conscience does begin to prick you about some of the things that you did when you were there. Some of them would be justified by any rules of war, if indeed war has any rules, and others not so much.
Yeah, Carl Morlanta says, I killed him, the first person he killed, but he wasn't the only casualty. The civilized version of me died with him. Yeah. And that's...
Yeah. But, you know, keep in mind, this isn't the result of a kind of military training, right? I mean, that military training exploits something that already is a human capacity. Many of you, I think, would easily resort to violence if your children were threatened, if your spouse was threatened. You may or may not if you yourself were threatened. But certainly, people who are defenseless and counting on you for protection, if they were threatened by someone who meant to really harm them, I think most people wouldn't hesitate. And it would leave you with a psychological legacy. But in that moment, I mean, we are the descendants of earlier humans that acted with violence when confronted with violence rather than die. And I can say for myself, I mean, I grew up during Vietnam, a very liberal household, a pacifist in for 100 miles in every direction, the works, right? And my film, The Last Patrol, I took 2 combat vets from Restrepo and another, a war reporter.
I'm sorry.
We're finally getting that quote here.
So
Another good reason for your flip.
That's right. So we walked. We were basically high-speed vagrants for a year, off and on for a year. We walked from Washington D.C. up to Philly along the railroad line, sleeping under bridges and abandoned buildings in the woods, cooking our meals over fires, all the way to Pittsburgh. And somewhere in Pennsylvania, we were camped out under an old bridge, and someone started shooting at us. And all of us had been in combat. All of us had lost people in combat. None of us were going back to combat, and suddenly there was that familiar snapping sound of bullets going over your head. And I really flipped out. These were my guys, right? Like, I was the oldest in this group. The trip was my idea. All we had with us was a machete. And I grabbed the machete, and I'm a good runner, and I thought, I'm gonna get behind this guy. We were in the woods. I thought, I'm gonna just do a big circle. I'm gonna come up behind this guy. And he stopped shooting, and he left before I got him. But thank God, because I don't know what I would have done. I wasn't upset that I was in danger. I was upset that he was endangering people that I cared about, that I loved, and who were counting on me, right? And so that capacity, frankly, it's in all of us, I think.
Now, that contrasts so remarkably with the story you began your book with about traveling across country, and you see a man heading towards you. And could you relate that story again?
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of the twin faces of humanity is that we're capable of organized violence against outsiders, but also that we really take care of our own. I mean, even chimpanzees, their closest animal relatives, really do not take care in the same way of the vulnerable and the weak in their own society in the way that we do. And so I was hitchhiking across the country when I was young, and I wound up in outside Gillette, Wyoming, which was very cold. It was late fall. It was a tough town. I think it probably still is. It's a coal mining town. And I was out there on the highway, and I stuck for an hour or two. People were throwing beer bottles at me, pickup trucks, guys throwing beer bottles at me. Very hostile place. And eventually I saw this guy walking towards me in this sort of bitter cold, and he was clearly homeless. I mean, you can tell from a distance. I mean, this guy clearly lived outside and was not doing well. And I had a backpack. I'd saved up some money, and I had food in it. I was after college. I was doing this adventure, right? And this guy came walking up to me at a lunchbox, and I just thought, this guy's got nothing. I got a backpack full of stuff. He's gonna rob me. I mean, I felt really threatened, and he was a big guy, and he walked up to me and he said, "Where are you going?" And I said, "I'm going to California." And he said, "How much food you got?" And in my sort of paranoid, young, youthful, paranoid way, I thought, he wants me to open my pack up, and then he's going to see what I have, and it's not going to go well. So I said, I just have a little cheese. And he looked at me. He said, you can't get to California on a little cheese. and he said, I live in a car. He said, I live in a broken down car in town. Every day I walk out to the coal mines, 3 miles. Once or twice a week, someone's sick and they need me. The other days they don't need me, and I walk back to my car. And today they don't need me, so I won't be needing this. And he lifted up his lunchbox. He said, "You need it more than I do." And he opened it up, and it was a bologna sandwich and an apple and a bag of potato chips that I think he'd probably gotten at a church that morning. And of course I protested, and he insisted, and he gave me the lunch, and he gave me a sort of lifelong lesson about taking responsibility for others. He'd seen me out on the highway, and he figured I was homeless like he was, right? And he just went out there to check on a brother, basically.
That's a beautiful story. Yeah. Now, we want to give the audience a chance to join with us, and maybe I'll ask Phil if there's something that we haven't touched on already that you might want to go back to. I was reading over my notes, and Carl Marlantes talked about how we measure our success in war. He says one thing that was very important in Vietnam was the kill ratio. And what was the kill ratio? It was the number of Vietnamese that we killed versus the number of Americans that they killed. And he said this number the number we killed of them versus the number they killed of us, it didn't matter. Only the us part mattered to us. And that we leave a trail behind when in Afghanistan, in Vietnam, in Iraq, and now in Syria, no doubt, and Yemen and 15 other places, and this trail of us and them that we've left behind. Too heavy.
I'm sorry.
It's not
You
really
didn't
a
get the
question.
question.
I think it's a statement an observation
Yeah.
we all kind of agree with.
Yeah, you're right.
And I mean, but what you're talking about is the sort of emotional gap between people who fight the war and people who run it. And my book is about small scale societies. And in a small scale society, all the things that keep people alive, which includes warfare, by the way, all the things that keep people alive and safe are at least the whole community is at least intimately acquainted with those processes, if not actually involved in them. So if the Apache go out on a raid against their sort of Navajo enemies and kill some people or get killed, those deaths are experienced by the entire community. I mean, the warriors are doing the killing, but the entire community, morally speaking, is part of the killing. When Custer attacked the villages on the Little Bighorn in 1876, after the battle was over, it was the women that went up the hill and killed the wounded. They were part of it, right? And the problem with a large-scale modern society is that these processes are sort of subcontracted out. And it's not just soldiering. It's everything, right? I'm an environmentalist. I mean, just on some basic level, there are these ironies that no one wants to deal with. Like, I'm an environmentalist. I think that carbon emissions are killing the planet. I drive a car. You know what I mean? I mean, how can I do that? We all do that, right? I mean, I have friends, very liberal friends, during the Iraq War who had bumper stickers that said "No blood for oil" on their car. Right? So there's this distance between your beliefs and the things that are actually keeping you alive. And in a small-scale society, all those things are integrated. And they're integrated morally as well. And I think the problem with war in a modern society is that morality is not integrated. And it's extremely painful for the soldiers. And I think in a sort of unconscious way, it's painful for the civilian population as well.
Well, we were maybe in that draft age period, and people were drafted into the military, not so much in the Marine Corps. I guess you guys were the elite. You just ask any Marine, and they'll tell you. Yeah. But this if society is the group in place of the tribe, the big society, then all of us should be contributing. And I think your father once gave you a lecture about that, Sebastian. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, just very briefly, my father grew up in Europe. He came to his father was Jewish. He came to this country during World War II. He was a two-time war refugee from the Spanish Civil War and then from World War II. He came here. He had asthma, so he couldn't join the military. He became a physicist, and he helped this nation quite a lot in that capacity. But he was a pacifist, and he also made it very clear to me that this country saved Europe from fascism, saved humanity basically from fascism. And but I grew up during Vietnam. Every adult I knew was against it. And so when I got my selective service card in the mail in 1980, I was 18. I think I was the first birth year to get the selective service card when the draft ended. I can't remember. Anyway, I was one of the first. And I didn't know what this was. Like, what the hell is this? I thought the draft was over. And I went to my father. I said, I'm not signing this, right? Like, this is ridiculous. The government wants to know my address so they can come find me if they have another war to fight. Are you kidding? Right? And I'd been nicely programmed by my environment, right? That's how I saw this. And he looked at me, and he was a deep, deep pacifist, right? He said, "Oh no, you're signing that." And I said, really? And he said there's thousands of graves of young American men your age in Europe, and they died defending the world from fascism. And you don't owe your country nothing, and you might owe your country your life. And the next war to be fought might have to be fought. And if you think it's not a moral war, then it's your duty to protest it. You even go to jail if you have to. But you don't know that yet. And it might be another World War II, and your country really might need you. And when he put it that way, all of a sudden I realized, oh my God, I can be part of something bigger than myself, which is what every young person wants to feel, that feeling, right? And so I signed that card with an enormous amount of pride, and sent it in. And it was the first time that I felt like I was a citizen of a country, because something was being asked of me. And I think it's a real tragedy in this. I think it's not moral to send people to fight a war they don't believe in. But I think it's completely moral to ask people to contribute their time and energy to the nation they live in. Yeah.
I think that's a good moment to ask that the house lights come up a little bit, and we'll give you an opportunity to ask a question. That's a question is something that ends with a question mark. So I know we all have strong feelings about this and that, but we also have a lot of wonderful, fabulous, full house here, and so I want to give people the opportunity to ask questions, and we'll start here in the back.
Hi, thank you all. What is today, Sebastian and Phil, the moral equivalent of combat? How can we be part of this society and contribute to it? I know both of you have thought about this, and I'd be curious about your answers.
Wow. Yeah, I'll have to preface that by saying that's a really, really difficult question to answer. I know that I think it was William James, the psychologist, who first used that phrase about finding a moral equivalent of war. Personally, I think looking back on my own family's history and the history of the families that I grew up with is that involving yourself in your community, involving yourself in work that is meaningful for you, and supporting your family, taking care of your family, all of that may not be quite the moral equivalent of war, but it will give your life a sense of direction and purpose that at least approximates that which can be experienced in combat. I think that one of the reasons we've seen this terrible spike in drug addiction and suicides in the working class, as it's called, of America is because a lot of people are now beginning to feel as if they are superfluous to their own society, that they have been put out of work by globalization, they've been put out of work by robotics, they no longer feel necessary even to their own family, much less to their town or their community. Were I smarter than I am, and perhaps did something other than what I do, I could come up with a detailed answer to your question. But I can't go beyond that. Maybe. Yeah, I hope you can.
just to reinforce that a bit, I mean, on a sort of policy level, I think mandatory national service with a military option is a great idea. I think it's very helpful for the individual.
Yeah,
and I think it's good for the nation. I mean, psychologists will tell you that the more you sacrifice for something, the more you value it. We want to value our citizenship. I think, but beyond policy, just as individuals leading your lives, for me, the thing that is worth my time, always worth my time, and might even be worth my life, are things that tend to protect or even elevate human dignity. I mean, that for me is like the the thing that, and the decisions I've made as a war reporter, what risks to take, what risks not to take, that to me is like, will human dignity benefit in some way from this thing that I'm doing? And finally, if you can think beyond yourself, you will be much, much better off psychologically. I just spoke at Amherst. The campus mental health counselor told me that when she counsels students who are depressed, she usually advises that they do community service in the town, and that really, really helps them. I had the great fortune to run across, to meet a gentleman last year outside of a hotel in Virginia. I'd given a talk at Norfolk Naval Base the night before. He wheeled himself out in a wheelchair, an older gentleman in his 70s, missing half his right leg. Tried to get into a car under the carport, and he couldn't get in. I asked if I could help him, and he said no, I just have to wait for my wife to unlock the car. And I said, he's very clear that he had just lost his leg, just recently. It was bandaged. And I said, that seems really difficult. And he said, well, it's interesting anyway. So he wouldn't even pity his situation. And I tried again, and I said, well, sir, you seem really brave about it. And he looked at me like, really, like I was the biggest fool he'd met all week. And he said, brave about it, there's people in this country missing 2 legs. So not only was he being very noble about his citizenship, that concern for others actually buffered him from his own suffering. There should be a statue to that guy. Live like that guy.
Up in the balcony.
Mr. Junger, maybe a confirmation question to you. As a proud father of 2 sons, one a veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan, the second still active, and a returning vet from Afghanistan. He reacted. He's a captain in the Army. He hasn't read your book yet, and I will make sure he does. But he reacted to his troopers coming back. He said these young people are better people when they're deployed, and when they get back, they actually kind of, he says it, they lose their mind, and I'm responsible for them. Have you taken it to that point as well, as to what that might mean?
I mean, acting well, it's very clear what acting well means in combat. You know, it's very, very clear. There's a bright line between acting well and not acting well. Serving yourself ahead of others, protecting yourself ahead of others is acting badly in combat. In this society, putting yourself first is often admired. I mean, witness the dozen or so men, I think exclusively men, who collapsed our economy in 2008. I mean, not only were they no one indicted, they cost us $14 trillion. Not only was no one indicted, but those guys, most of them were taking, while their companies were getting bailed out, they were taking multi-million-dollar year-end bonuses that year. Like, those guys in combat don't last very long, right? And so you're coming from a world where, in combat, where you're the least important thing, to a world where no one's, and you're defending a country, and then you come back to that country and all the rules are the opposite. That can't feel good. Unless you're that guy in the wheelchair. I mean, there are some people that keep that humanity and put other people first. And I guarantee you that those people are psychologically healthier than those gentlemen on Wall Street. I mean, they will live happier lives than those guys.
In the back on the right. Yeah.
Hello, and thank you for being here tonight. I'm wondering if any of you have given any thought to a possible connection, whether it be psychologically, evolutionarily, even tribally, to the kind of war experiences that you've written about and the epidemic, the prevalence of gun violence in our country.
Anyone armed here? No.
No, I think that the the gun violence the fact is, by the way, I just read in the local paper here that there was another mass shooting in California today. Not quite the casualty toll of the previous two, but there were 4 people killed at random by a gunman. But I think the problem there, culturally, I'm not going to speak about gun control or the number of guns, but culturally is that this kind of rugged individualism, when it becomes pathological, turns into this extreme isolation of these shooters, these people who they have no connection whatever to their fellow human being and are so, if you will, self-involved, so self-aggrandizing that they feel that if they have a grudge against society, if they've lost their job, they've had an argument with their wife, whatever the cause may be, they have some kind of right to express their unhappiness, their misery, by eliminating other people's lives. And that to me is, the connection is that they're in a way not tribal. They're utterly isolated human beings with no sense of community, no sense of connection with their fellow human being.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I'll just add to it. I mean, there are countries with a higher crime rate. There are other countries with very easy access to guns like we have. Every country has deranged people in it. But we are the only country that perpetrates this bizarre sort of nihilistic thing of mass shootings. Gang violence, there's a kind of logic to gang violence, right? They're turf wars, basically. There's a kind of logic to crime. There's a kind of logic to all of it, although they're tragedies as well, but they make a kind of sense. Mass shootings of people you don't know, that's completely nihilistic, right? There isn't there's no logical end point to that. And we are the only country that does that to ourselves regularly. And I'll add that the communities that these kinds of mass shootings happen in, almost without exception, are majority white, safe, middle class, Christian, low crime communities. A mass shooting of this sort has never happened in a low-income, quote, ghetto neighborhood in an inner city. It just doesn't. There's other kinds of crime, there's other kinds of violence, but that particular kind of nihilism, where you bring an assault weapon into a school and see how many people you can kill before you get killed, that kind of thing has never happened in a low-income urban neighborhood. And I can't prove this, right? I'm not even trying to prove this, but to me, it's, I think, probably not a coincidence that the very communities that seem to breed depression and loneliness and suicide and isolation also offer so little community that people who have a real emotional problem don't feel compelled to protect others from their violence. They let it out. And for all of the stresses of poor urban communities, there is some community there that may buffer mentally ill people from doing that. I don't know, but it's remarkable. Those statistics are remarkable.
Okay, up there, and then we have several questions down here as well. Go ahead.
Good evening. First, I'd like to thank you both for your service to this country. My parents were both military, and I know that you guys don't get enough recognition. And this question is more for Mr. Junger. I would like to bring up that Margaret Mead once wrote an article about war being an invention of the human race. And I was wondering if you agreed with her, both from a standpoint of having been in a war and also now as a civilian and researcher.
I'm not a primatologist, but I'm pretty good friends with someone named Richard Wrangham at Harvard. And he was a student of Jane Goodall, and he has studied chimpanzees really, really extensively. And chimpanzees are the only other species that he knows of that conduct sort of organized violence against rival troops. So 5 or 6 males will basically go on a raid into the territory of a rival troop of chimpanzees, and they will find lone enemy males and beat them to death. And they'll conduct these raids over a period of months, and one by one they will kill the males of the rival troop, and then they will take over that territory and their females. And so that kind of organized aggression against rivals is absolutely rewarded in Darwinian terms. That more aggressive troop then obviously passes on its DNA, the vanquished troop doesn't. And so no, we didn't quite invent warfare, but almost. I mean, we share, I think, 98% of our DNA with chimpanzees. The difference, and this is to me really, really interesting. Richard said that when one of these lone males is being ganged up on and beaten to death by, outnumbered by 5 or 6 enemy males, I'll just call them friends, right? I mean, his associates in the males in his troop that hear his cries of panic and fear, they will not rush to his aid. They will flee, they will save themselves. What's really interesting about humans, and maybe one of the very few things that separates us from other primates and from the rest of the animal kingdom, is that we will sacrifice our lives for same-sex peers. It makes sense to sacrifice your life for your children. It might even make sense to sacrifice your life for your spouse. But we humans are the only species that will do that for a same-sex peer. That kind of altruism, it clearly has a Darwinian purpose. If you do that, you're usually related in some way to the other people in your community, and if you're fighting like that, your group is more likely to survive. It has a kind of logic. But that requires a really profound emotional bond, and it probably requires language. Like if you act with cowardice and you run away from your wife's brother on the battlefield, if you're a chimpanzee, nobody can repeat that awful story, right? You come home and nobody knows. But likewise, heroism is not rewarded because no one can repeat your deeds of heroism. You're not rewarded when you get back, right? But with humans, because we have language, all of a sudden you're accountable for your actions, and you're either penalized or rewarded for heroism, and that is, according to Richard, the difference between humans and our closest relatives.
Yes, my question has to do with community and individuality and conformity. And these things have been on my mind a lot in the last couple of years because I wrote a book called Becoming Amish, and I've studied the Amish. And when I read Tribe, I felt like I saw so many shared themes there as far as community goes. And I recall the conversation I had with an Amish bishop when I said, what's the biggest hurdle to becoming Amish? And he said, really without hesitating, individuality, and that in the broader American society, individuality is so celebrated and honored to such a great degree, and that to join the Amish, you need to give some of that up. You need to conform a little bit. And so my question is, I wonder, do you think we can create this stronger community that I completely agree with you that we need today, and is very broken in America? Can we get there while our national discourse has sort of taken this idea of individuality to, in my view, almost like this cartoon level? And I'm just wondering, what you think of that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we can, but I think that we're going to have to shed some almost sacred beliefs that we've got. For example, the idea of the rugged individual, the rugged American individual, that probably dates back to the frontier myth. I think that somehow or another, that idea as part of our culture needs to be re-examined. I mean, it has been re-examined, like, during World War II and during the Depression, a lot of people, a lot of the country pulled together. And I actually think that we were probably a happier country back then. I certainly think that this is my most radical, idiotic idea, but I think we would benefit by deciding to become less efficient. Now, for example, I mean, we had an example right here, okay? I have this thing, and he's got that thing.
If you can't see it, we're
in
looking,
actual fact,
Sebastian has
this
a flip
thing
phone.
This thing makes my life a lot more, I have to admit, convenient than it used to be. But at the same time, this thing intrudes on my life a lot more than my life used to be intruded upon before I had it. And I would relate that to what we were discussing earlier. I had mentioned about the alienation, if you will, of the working class due to globalization and robotization, because these things are more efficient. It's obvious that any machine can do anything we can do better and faster and more profitably. But why not say the hell with it? Why not actually say that, I mean, life isn't so bad here at the moment. For example, I can cite a practical example from two very disparate places, New Jersey and Mexico. If you go to New Jersey, you have a hard time finding an automatic or an automated gas pump. They actually have gas station attendants that fill your gas tank. Mexico, as a matter of fact, not only do they have attendants that'll fill your gas tank, they have guys that come out, wash the windows, they do check the water and oil and all that stuff that used to be done back in the 1940s. Why do they do that? Because it employs people. It gives people a sense of purpose. And it, in a way, contributes to the sense of community. And I mean, that's my little idea that nobody will ever adopt, I'm sure, because... But I think it wouldn't be a bad idea. You mentioned the Amish. What could be more inefficient than riding a horse and buggy and building your own barn with your fellow townspeople and baling hay? So,
I would just add this auditorium is filled with volunteers, people who do a lot for our community, and we are an example, I think, of how a community can create itself, basically. That there are just so many people, there's probably $1 billion of annual income that is not received by the people in this audience who do things for us and for each other. And we pay attention to the lives around us in a way that a bigger city doesn't often do. No, we have to have a microphone because we're recording. Oh. We have to have it recorded, though. Thank you. In case you say something radical.
Well, I'm from Los Angeles, so it kind of goes with it. My question is for both Mr. Caputo and Mr. Junger.
Hold it up, please. Yeah.
Sorry about that. You guys, you were Force Recon in Marine Force Recon in Vietnam, and you're embedding yourself on the side of a mountain with a strap-up piece. It was brilliant. You've both gone and done extraordinary things with your talents. But the thing I sort of subscribe to is that there are certain things that you see that you can't unsee. So my question is, I'm interested in the story behind the storytellers. And did you come away from these experiences imprinted with what happened?
I didn't get the last part of it.
Did you come away imprinted for the rest of your life by what happened in Vietnam?
Well, PTSD is an interesting term, first of all, because I've often asked, well, what's the disorder? You had the trauma. This is the post-trauma period you're in. Now, if war is considered normal, then okay, then you have a disorder. But if war is not normal, if that's not the way your human condition should be, then it isn't a disorder. It's the result of being exposed.
Yeah, the people that just not quite answering your question, but I just want to make a comment, is that a person that I would be really wary and scared of would be somebody that went through an experience, say, like Afghanistan or Vietnam, and came out exactly the same as when. You know, but to answer your question, yes, the experience that I underwent in Vietnam imprinted me to the point that I almost consider it a place where I died and was reborn. And I have very vague memories of my life before Vietnam, and yet to this day, the most vivid memories of it. But it also imprinted me in another way, in that I felt that I learned a great deal, if not everything, about human nature and about my own nature, some of it which was not particularly pleasant to learn, but I did learn it. And it's certainly affected everything I've done and all of the work I've done since then.
And, keep in mind, war is not the only place where trauma happens. I mean, everyone in this room has been or will be traumatized in their life. Everyone in this room will experience PTSD. Or they had better, because that's how you recover from trauma. I mean, the human animal evolved in an environment that was very, very, very traumatic, very dangerous, very difficult. And if exposure to trauma permanently psychologically disabled us, made us effectively wards of the state, wards of the tribe, we wouldn't exist. We wouldn't be here. We're the descendants of individuals that reacted to trauma in these predictable ways. You lay low, you have nightmares to remind yourself of the thing that's dangerous. You have a capacity for anger. There's all these defensive reactions that prepare you to survive a period of danger that typically lasts some weeks, some months, maybe a year. About 20% of people exposed to trauma wind up in a long-term, with a long-term disorder, and in this case it is a disorder, because at this point, after a year or so after the trauma, if you're still in that loop, it's actually maladaptive. It's not helping you survive, it's hindering your survival. And at that point, it really does become a disorder. But more broadly, I mean, has anyone ever lived a life that has not affected them permanently? I mean, that's life. It builds you up, it makes you stronger, and it scars you. And I can say I was absolutely traumatized by war, absolutely. And I worked my way through it. Certain noises I still jump at, but that's not the end of the world. But more importantly, I think, is that it forces you to encounter your humanity. And what happened to me, particularly after I was in the Korangal Valley off and on for a year, I came home, and for the first time in my life, and ever since then, I had suddenly a profound capacity for emotion. Like, suddenly I was feeling things. I was feeling things at weddings. I was feeling things in the post office. I was tearing up at the weirdest things. I was feeling very happy at other things. Like, all of a sudden I had full access to the sort of the continent of emotions that's in all of us. And it took war, frankly, it took war to break that open. And in some ways, it even took the death of my dear friend Tim. And it finally sort of cracked my exterior shell. And I'm a much fuller, better human being for it. So those experiences, there really is a sort of yin and yang of them. And I can't imagine, I would be a much lesser person without having been to war. I feel very lucky to be able to say that.
Up in the balcony on the left.
You've talked quite a bit about tribal selflessness and service. Here's a question. I heard on NPR recently that there's a super PAC raising money for veterans to run for office. Yeah. Sebastian, you heard that as well. Presumably Congress, higher office as well. I suppose the impetus is veterans will be more likely to cross the aisle and not have this infighting in Washington, but could be better leaders. How do you think, if most of Congress, if the White House was run by veterans, how might that impact the leaders of the country and the leadership of the country?
Well,
We will have that opportunity at the next election, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would hope so. I mean, I think the Congress was a much more functional institution post World War II because almost everybody in Congress at that time had been involved in the war effort. Even in my era, I recall being assigned by John Kennedy Jr.'s magazine. It was called George magazine that he ran for a while, to do a story on all of the Vietnam veterans that were then in the Senate and the House. And I think there were 26 or 27. It's rather difficult now to find very many that had any of that military experience and that sense of cooperation as well as the sense of serving, again, something greater than themselves, in that case, the country. I think right now, one of our difficulties is that we've got way too many people that are in politics either for themselves or serving some narrow ideology. And I would hope that the men and women who have served in these conflicts, actually the conflict is still ongoing, will enter politics and lead this country out of what I feel the miasma it is now in.
Yeah. Let me just say, because I know about this organization and I'm really sort of entranced by it. It's called With Honor. Like, go home, look it up, and donate to it. And it's the people who are running for Congress with this organization. They make a pledge of bipartisanship, and they make a pledge to put the interests of the country ahead of the interests of whatever party they're in. And it's people from both parties. And they make a pledge to socialize once a week with someone across the aisle. And it's an extraordinary thing. And I feel, we've gotten to this point where the two parties are basically cartels. I mean, in the sense that they exist. I didn't say criminal cartels, but I thought about it. No. I mean, by
you
that
wouldn't
I
have
mean
been far wrong if you did that.
they exist to perpetuate their own power within the government, and both sides do it. I happen to be a Democrat, but both sides do it, and I think that that kind of like that completely partisan thinking you really don't find in a platoon. Like, none of those guys that I was with really cared who was liberal or conservative. It just didn't matter. And I think had those guys come home and if they got into government, they would retain some of that thinking, and the nation would be better for it.
Last question, way in the back.
I'm wondering if you could comment on the morality of endless war and what impact that could have on our culture and on some of the actions that we see, the bad actions that we see going around our country. Thank you.
Let me just start by saying something that when a parent sends a child off to fight in a war, the father or the mother might say, I'll see you when you get back. And the child would really have to say, no, you won't, because I won't be back. Who will come back is going to be someone different. And we have changed our society. Not this, maybe in this room, so many of our children have gone off to war because we have a so-called volunteer force. And I say so-called because, yes, they're volunteers. but are they representative of our society? We talked earlier about mandatory national service, or maybe it should be mandatory international service. Whatever it is, we are not serving that greater good, but wherever we send someone off, whether it be to cover the war in Bosnia or to fight in Afghanistan or Iraq or Yemen or any of those other places, those people do not come back unchanged. And by that fact, they change our society as well.
Well, yeah, again, endless war obviously would be deleterious to a society, and we've now been in a war of some sort for nearly 20 years. I think what's bad for our society is that the burden of this war is being borne exclusively by about 1% of the population. And I think the danger to our American society right now is that we're developing a kind of warrior class that is disconnected from the rest of the society, and the rest of the society is quite happy to have them disconnected, to have them take all the risks, make all the sacrifices, while everybody else, you know, what was the phrase? I forgot what a general said. The United States Army is at war. The American public is at the mall. And so I think that the continuation of the situation we're now in is not going to be particularly good for the society. That's why I was really happy to hear Sebastian mention the importance of national service. I wanted to add to that in addition to making people more aware of the society and the culture that they are part of and are serving, is it also is an effective antidote to this inequality that exists. I know when I was in, you really did have the thing of the Harvard graduate having the same bunk as a guy that maybe finished 2 years of high school, but they had to work together so that maybe the kid who had 2 years of high school would realize that he could aspire to something greater, but that guy that went to Harvard, instead of saying, well, I think I'll get out of Harvard and go start my own hedge fund, would realize that there are people who are so much less fortunate than he, but nevertheless are valuable human beings who have a contribution to make.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for being here. Thank
Wait,
you to
there's a desperate wave.
a
back
desperate
there.
wave. All right, we'll take one last from a neighbor, so I can't avoid this.
Otherwise, I'd be over there tomorrow. I have an appreciation and a request that I can make it into a question. The appreciation is that Sebastian, for about 18 months, Reigning Liberty Ranch, and I probably can speak for Peace Ranch too, have been using your book as a blueprint for understanding, for planning, for programs, and you're impacting lives, you're saving lives.
Thank you.
My request, it goes back to something we talked about 2 hours ago out in the lobby, and it still puzzles me, is why do UK military who fight in the same zone come back and only have 50% of the PTSD and depression as the American soldiers? What is different?
Thank you. I can answer this pretty quickly, I think. The Israeli military has a PTSD rate of 1%. The reason is, Israeli psychologists will tell you, is because of national service. Everyone serves in the military, and that buffers people against psychological harm. The U.S. military has a PTSD rate of 20%, which is amazing considering that only 10% of the U.S. military is actually in combat. So something grave is going on when they come home. The British military has a rate of about half of what we do. There is no explanation. They have the same kind of modern society that we do. It's a smaller nation. Maybe that helps. I don't know. But the one explanation I actually did read, and it was just a theory by an English psychologist, and he literally said, England is a drinking culture, and they may be medicating themselves and basically camouflaging their PTSD.
And voting for Brexit, right?
Well, all right, this was a perfect segue, because the bar has remained open specifically tonight. The two wonderful authors will be outside signing books for you.
Thank you all.
Thank you all for being
Thank
here.
you.